Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from today. I'd like to welcome you. My name is Anherad Lang. For those of you who don't know me yet, I'm the Executive Director of PHAP. That's short for the International Association of Professionals in Humanitarian Assistance and Protection. I'm very pleased to be welcoming you today for this fifth session in the learning stream on humanitarian financing, jointly organized by PHAP and ICVA. Today's session is going to be focusing on private funding and its potential for the humanitarian sector. And I have to say this is a great start, I think, to this new year of online events. Great to see many returning participants. And just to note, we had a great set of registrants for today's event joining from, I think, more than 90 countries. And it's great to see so many of you joining us already in the interactive platform. And I know many others are connecting via the live streaming link. So warm welcome again to everyone. And I'd like to introduce my co-host once again. Very pleased to be co-hosting with Melissa Patati, Head of Policy at ICVA. Over to you, Melissa.
Thank you so much. Yes, for those of you who don't know, ICVA is a network of NGOs dedicated to principled and effective humanitarian action, and we're trying to help NGOs in the network better understand humanitarian financing, so we're very happy to have this opportunity to collaborate with PHAP in this webinar series. So if you've been participating in earlier webinars, you would know that the gap between humanitarian needs and available resources is increasing. Companies, foundations, and individuals can have a greater, extremely significant role in filling this gap. In addition, the role of the private sector is also shifting from a primary role as donor to becoming a key partner in humanitarian action, offering in-kind contributions through logistics, information technology, and other expertise.
So now moving on to introduce today's session. In the last four sessions, the last four webinars, as many of you will recall, we focused on the overall humanitarian financing landscape, UN humanitarian funding through partnerships with NGOs, and access to pooled funds and direct funding from governmental donors. Now, today we're going to be focusing on the growing potential of private funding in financing humanitarian work in different contexts, not only targeting disaster relief response, but also increasingly funding aid in humanitarian crises caused or protracted by armed conflicts. So providing you with an overview of private sector funding mechanisms, emerging trends, and fundraising opportunities for NGOs. So in this area, we've specifically identified a few learning objectives. I'll go through those now. First is the awareness of the primary factors that drive funding from the private sector to the humanitarian sector. Second, we'll be looking at familiarity with different sources of private funding, including donations, trusts, foundations, and fundraising campaigns. Third, we'll be trying to build awareness of the main trends and challenges regarding NGO access to private funding sources. And finally, aiming to build knowledge of the different sources of information available on private funding. Now, I'll hand it over again to Melissa to introduce today's speakers.
Today we are lucky to have a panel led by three women with different complementary expertise in private humanitarian funding. First we have Charlotte Latimer. She is an expert in humanitarian financing and an author of the 2016 Global Humanitarian Assistance Report. Her current role with development initiatives focuses on analysis of financing to prevent and respond to crises, including efforts to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of financing in crisis situations, such as multi-year approaches, localization of funding, more transparent and traceable funding, and flexible financing. And Amik Chikasosa started in the financing team at the IKEA Foundation in 2009. She now leads the IKEA Foundation's work in the humanitarian sector and coordinates their emergency relief responses. After graduating with her master's degree in international law, she worked in South Africa and Ghana with local non-governmental organizations focusing on human rights. Rebecca Davies is leading Save the Children's on developing a global humanitarian and emergency fundraising strategy. She was recently the Chief Development Officer at Save the Children Canada, and prior to that, Director of Fundraising at Médecins Sans Frontières in Canada for 7 years, where she led the team to deliver 163% growth in income, including tripling monthly donations and achieving 200% growth in major and planned giving revenue.
Excellent. Okay, so we're going to turn first to Charlotte for our first presentation. Charlotte, I'll hand the floor over to you.
Thank you very much for the introductions, and Melissa, you've introduced me, but let me introduce a little bit development initiatives and the work that we do. So we provide data on poorest and most crisis-affected people, and particularly the resources that are used to address poverty and vulnerability and crises. And as Melissa mentioned, one of our main publications is the Global Humanitarian Assistance Report, and that looks every year at funding in crisis settings, how much funding, where does it come from, where does it go, etc. And when we look at how much and where does it come from, we're considering both funding from international humanitarian funding from both government donors and private donors. And obviously the funding for private donors is what I'll focus on today. And the data that I'm quoting is you can find in the GHA report, which is online, and I can put a link to that in the chat later. So let's move straight on. I'm going to start by looking at the overall international humanitarian assistance picture. So we could see in 2013 and 14, we've seen consecutive increases in the amount of total funding. And then in 2015, we saw that amount go up again. So this time going up to a record 28 billion US dollars. So that's an increase on the previous year, but a 50% increase on the amount provided in 2012. And that's both from government and from private donors. But as Melissa said, despite the fact that funding looks like it's going up, there is still a huge shortfall in terms of responding to urgent humanitarian needs. And we've seen, for example, through the UN coordinated appeals, an unprecedented shortfall in 2000 of about 45% of funding that was not contributed to those appeals, and it looks similar in 2016. But I'm going to focus specifically now on the funding to from private donors. So we can see there a similar picture in terms of the trend. So again in 2015, international humanitarian assistance from private sources going up for a third year running and reaching a figure of 6.2 billion US dollars. So overall, over a period of time, private donors are now accounting for just less than a quarter of all international humanitarian assistance. I just want to say a very brief word about the data here, because I want to stress that the numbers that I'm quoting are very much estimates that we gather. We create a unique data set within development initiatives of funding from private organizations, but there's a lot we don't know, and it very, very likely the total value of private giving is significantly higher than I'm presenting here, because there's a lot that goes uncounted. Let's have a look. When I'm talking about private donors or private funding, it's actually a very mixed and diverse set of donors. So let's have a look now at who, what from companies and corporations, trusts and foundations, and national societies, all making up that set of private donors. But if we break it down and we look at where the bulk of the funding is coming from, we see that by far the bulk is coming from individuals. So between 2010 and 2014, if we lump those years together, it's around 70% of all reported private funding generated by individual giving. That's just people, donating contributing from their own pockets. You can't see it here, but actually when we look at the numbers, we can see also increases in funding from private companies and corporations, as well as funding from trusts and foundations that's been increasing over recent years. I want to just pull out from that data to just have a look at what it looks like if you do that same breakdown, but you look at the private humanitarian funding for NGOs only, and you see that reliance on funding from individuals is even starker. So we see that in that same period, 2010 to 2014, nearly 80%, so 79% of the private humanitarian income of NGOs in our data set came from individuals. Now I want to have a look at where the funding goes, the private funding. Now this is a complex set of let me just interpret a little bit for you. What we see is, of course, the different donors, different types of donors make different choices about where to allocate their funding, and we look in specific crises to see where the funding is coming from government donors and from private donors. And we see in situations like Yemen and Sudan, as are shown here, these are conflict-driven, protracted crises, that funding from government donors from different regions really dominates, and there's virtually no visibility of funding from private donors. But if you look at a situation like Nepal, this was in 2015, and this was in response to the Nepal earthquake in 2015, and we can see there's a pale pink slice of that donut there, which is nearly a third of all funding for the Nepal earthquake came from private donors. And that really illustrates a trend that we see again and again, where private donors traditionally respond much more generously to disasters caused by natural hazards compared to protracted and conflict-driven emergencies. It is worth noting here, though, that private donors did give very generously to the Syria response in 2015. So they, in fact, were the Syria crisis as a whole was the largest recipient of all private funding that year, which really bucks that trend and goes against that trend. So most of that funding was channeled outside of the UN coordinated appeals, and the recipients of that funding, or the channels of that funding, the majority went to NGO actors. Just before I finish and hand back, I just want to say a quick word about how private funding is changing. Obviously, as we know, is this time of enormous and really severe humanitarian need, the focus on private actors as private donors is really increasing, and we're seeing new ideas coming in from private donors, new actors appearing, new partnerships, etc. All kinds of things that are changing. So we see initiatives like solidarity levies, for example, where there's a levy on an airline ticket which is used for fighting diseases. We've seen a lot of movement around things like Islamic social finance, which estimates range from between 10 to hundreds of billions of dollars in Islamic social finance. And the sort of initiatives and alliances that are being set up to actually transform that and channel that funding to international humanitarian response. So we've seen things like Maybank Islamic and Norwegian Refugee Council collaborating on a global humanitarian endowment fund, or the UNDP and the Islamic Development Bank coming together on Islamic finance. And also the role of the private sector really changing in terms of becoming partners in humanitarian assistance through in-kind contributions in areas like communications and logistics, and investments like MasterCard's work in new payment technologies for cash. So really dramatically changing the landscape, increasingly so as government funding becomes under scrutiny and subject to political changes and so on. Then the role of private donors becomes more and more central, and both in terms of volumes of funding, but different ways of funding and supporting humanitarian action. So I'll stop there. My contact details are there on that slide, and I'll hand back Melissa and Ankaret.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. So one of the things that you've been looking at through the context of your work has been looking at multi-year funding, and we've seen from NGOs that multi-year funding is quite important for sustainability. Chinenye of Nigeria is asking, from your perspective, how sustainable is private funding for NGOs? Are the private donors that you've been looking at engaged in multi-year programming, for example?
It's a really good question, and I think it gets to this question not just about the volume of private funding, but the quality of the funding as well. And I think particularly in terms of the funding coming from individuals, of course there's much greater flexibility in that funding, in whether it be funding that can be used for multi-year programs, but also in terms of fewer, simpler reporting requirements, less earmarking, of course, and more flexibility to actually allocate funds according to where the needs are greatest. And I'm not an expert, and I think we can hear from other presenters in terms of the flexibility and the quality of funding from trusts or foundations or companies. But I know from the perspective of just my own organisation that there is, in terms of funding from private donors, there is a different spirit of that funding often in terms of working in partnership, perhaps more collaboration and dialogue about what the work is for, and a bit more flexibility about responding to priorities. So I think yes, it's a good question, and I think one that it's not easy to get. I can't give a simple answer to that, but I think that certainly that in general private funding can be seen as really good quality funding as well as an important source.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Charlotte, and thanks for really highlighting those trends that are really thought-provoking, I think, on the larger picture, a good way to start us off. We're going to move now to our next presenter, so I'd like to give the floor to Annemie.
All right, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you all on today's learning session. I'm very happy to share a little bit, and let me start by telling you a little bit about the business to start with. So Ingvar Kamprad grew up in Småland, Sweden, and he started really small, funding his workforce primarily from people among his closest circle. So this grew steadily as time went on, but it really used to be local people who shared the same spirit and liked to work together. And it was after registering as a commercial enterprise in 1943 that the business grew fast with some of the latest numbers now on screen, almost 400 stores worldwide and over 180,000 co-workers. So people from Småland are said to have a spirit of humbleness towards nature's hard conditions. They have the willpower to overcome obstacles and, take a no-nonsense approach to problem solving in general and to business challenges in particular. So these characteristics really lay at the ground of who Ingvar is, and it really influenced his business philosophy, what we now refer to partially as the IKEA values in principle. You see a few of them on the slide there, but the values really help the business to address the needs of the many in a sustainable way. So today the owner of IKEA is IKEA Foundation. And we're the philanthropic arm of IKEA Foundation, which is our only funding stream. This means that we cannot take any public donations. But it also means that we have an innate sense of responsibility and accountability towards IKEA co-workers and customers, as it's through them that we're able to receive those funds. We're founded in 1982, but our first milestone really was in 2009 when our current CEO was hired to expand the foundation's work. We have our own objective, and because we need to keep a certain distance from the business as a charitable arm, we can go where the business cannot go, and we can program where we believe will have the most impact. So we've grown fast over the past few years. We won't grow to be that large, but we want to leverage partners' expertise and networks instead. So the IKEA business supported social initiatives fighting child labor in India, and in 2009 that's where we put them all under the umbrella of the foundation. And today the business safeguards human rights principles and mechanisms through the sustainability group, working directly with people in stores, in trading, and in the larger supply chain communities. And IKEA stores can directly engage also with communities closely around the store, so for instance a local children's hospital. But this shows where we cannot program. So if there's a large IKEA presence in a certain area, that's where the foundation ordinarily will not step in. So again, we work through our own objectives, and we find complementarity in aligning with the business on core themes, such as water or renewable energy, or, very importantly, on children. And our work is highlighted by engaging people through the campaigns that the stores can run, and our latest is the Let's Play for Change campaign. So when INCFAR registered the foundation, the goal was very much in line with the IKEA Compass, and it was driven by his notion that children need 4 fundamentals to succeed in life. The circle of prosperity, which is our underlying philosophy, and together with the same values that drive the business philosophy, that really guides us in our program choices. And then layered across all of our giving as well is our fight against climate change effects for communities that are hit hardest. And that's a joint effort or a common theme that we share with the business. Just to talk a little bit more about our space in the humanitarian sector. We have 4 sub-portfolios that you see on the right-hand side on the screen. So emergency relief, assisting refugees, sector strengthening, and resilience to climate change effects. And just to highlight one other aspect of this, we've decided to focus on a few countries to really ensure we can program meaningfully and with a long-term strategy in mind. The exception here is though the first phase response support in emergency situations where we respond to both natural and man-made disasters. Then this other slide shows you our financial commitment at high level, and that the humanitarian work actually has grown to take quite a significant allocation of the overall budget. So our goal going forward is to stay around that 30–35% mark against the overall budget. And in that, we also aim to work much more closely with work that our portfolios do in non-humanitarian settings, to really leverage the spending that they do, and hopefully that way contribute to prevention or adaptation activities that way too. To highlight our current partner set, there's 17 on the map at the moment, sorry. We're looking for a healthy balance between partners. So you see NGOs on the screen that implement activities directly. There's a think tank and a research group there to influence policy and to really provide academic strength to the theories that we're applying, and that we also partner with the UN to highlight best practices and to have a relationship with governments wherever that is possible. What's important to note on this slide is that we increasingly look to the best placed actors, and that could take any type of or shape. It could be an NGO, it could be social business, or any other form. To talk a little bit about the drivers on why we're engaging in humanitarian action, and I already highlighted how important the IKEA values are and how they guide us in our decision making. So INCFAR's drive to create better everyday life solutions are really to give people an opportunity to build themselves a home that is safe, that's enabling, and that's affordable. So again, our engagement in humanitarian action is even more important to build on, as children caught in displacement often don't have a home or a very unsafe one. So that's really what drives our engagement there. Another driver is the immense need that we see and the opportunity to take a business approach to grant making and humanitarian action. So again, we care about children, and so our driver is to support work that protects and educates children and really places them at the heart. And in this, it's important to program as if the person mattered, as in we want to ensure that the affected people help design and monitor the program. We're looking for organizations that allow people also to have room for creative thought. So, they're able to identify new ways of working and always trying to improve on how they do things. And, if we make the right investments now, it's more likely to have a more durable outcome. So we're always keeping an eye on the future. We also believe we can provide a different angle to the conversation, but take that back to our own communities as well when we're learning from others who are more familiar or very new to humanitarian action. So there's that sharing and learning opportunity. And then we also operate under the principles of good partnership that helps us to keep driving. And things included in that are, for instance, trust and long-term commitment. It's very similar to IKEA's way of working within the supply chain. They rather take the more difficult route and improve or set standards along the way than opting for easier but less efficient or impactful ways. So the last driver to talk about is we're seeing that we're all connected. Today's world offers opportunities to see what's happening at the other side of the world, and we know when people are in distress. We're seeing how major events that may have started small are all connected to global politics, to human migration, climate change, etc. So there's so many new technologies and connectivity out there that allows us to be informed. And in our view, that's an opportunity to get engaged as well. So particularly what we know about climate change and the speed with which it's affecting vulnerable populations even more so, we also want to take our responsibility and help program in a way that it not only helps people directly, but it reduces pressure on the environment, and it really also starts building out the next generation of thinkers and leaders and others, that know how to program keeping the planet and population safe and strong. So engaging in humanitarian action in light of that is vital, we believe, in addressing not only today's human suffering, but it will also allow for course correction to take place, and in that way really help create a safer place for all of our children. So just a little bit of advice on how NGOs can engage with private sector. There's 6 boxes there. So the first one is on impact, and we know that it can be very costly to monitor and program, measure a program that's really, that's long enough to see impact, but it is extremely important, and it can actually take place at a smaller level. So, it's important that staff is supported in measuring and learning, and that there's that budget for that. What I mean with the second line, show your network and its worth, means more that you align with others in a way that really builds out a strong and coherent program for affected people, and that you're not working by yourself. So again, sharing and learning is important to show, and that you again use that collective voice to speak up, towards the larger world, such as the UN or governments, and of course platforms like ICVA are extremely helpful in this. You see a quotation there, "Small is beautiful." That's by Fritz Schumacher. I recommend also reading from him. It's very interesting, and it's here to highlight that beautiful relationships can happen with local private sector, and it could actually be an IKEA store or trading office. But the point is that you don't always have to look far to have a very meaningful relationship with private sector actors. And then what I mean with setting yourself up for success is that you should always work towards being able to present your numbers, your information, your thoughts, your theory of change, and your governance structure in a clear way, as that brings a lot of confidence that you're ready to work and you can put quality in what you do. And that's something that we care about a lot. So, and then the line on like-mindedness is about looking for like-minded private sector groups or foundations, so they can find a more relatable cause and are more likely to get engaged. Keep in mind that private sector entities will always be interested to learn on how to improve their own ways of working. So your knowledge around a certain social issue or about a country can help them with that too. So an alignment interest can be very, very relevant. And then, yeah, just on being real and staying true, it's related to all the other elements. But just to highlight, we're interested in what's realistically achievable in the time and resources that are allocated to certain work, and that you throughout the project period have that constant dialogue about how the program can stay as true to the needs as possible. But you also communicate that in a very simple way. And then just to say that, I mean, from our point of view, we don't think it's only up to NGOs to reach out to the private sector. It should also be the other way around, and we need to put on our efforts as well and really look for those best placed actors. So we have a lot of direct conversations with NGOs. That's one way for us to engage. And then by purposefully focusing on a few countries, we really get to understand the NGO landscape much better and much deeper. So the idea is that we'll form more and more local partnerships in those focus groups. And it's important to listen to what the NGO needs and what an investment could look like. There's grants or loans, or you maybe have to invest in people themselves. So, you really need to have that honest dialogue to really help the NGO grow. Well, and what I mean with NGOs Plus is that as a funder, we need to open up for engaging with different actors. So we need to have different engagement procedures in place. We cannot apply a one-size-fits-all when it comes to formats and budgets and due diligence requirements. We need to have some flexibility in that, as was already mentioned before. And then lastly, we also feel one of our roles we should play is facilitating and convening, and really not only making the case for others to get engaged, but also amongst our current partner set that there is that. So that just brings me to the last slide. You'll see some links there. I bring you to our general website, and then also the People, Planet Positive strategy. So you see how IKEA is involved, but then also our own work related to materials and fact sheets on the bottom. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Annemiek. First, I want to thank you for mentioning the principles of partnership, which is quite important to the ICVA NGO network. Also, one of the things that struck me in your presentation was your emphasis on striking a healthy balance of partners, engaging different partners, and your point on small is beautiful. It relates to questions that we received from several participants, including this one from Lambert of the DRC, DR Congo, who asks, how can a small NGO get funded through a big philanthropic organization like the IKEA Foundation? Should they partner with bigger international NGOs, or can they get funded directly? So over to you.
Yeah, thanks Lambert for the question. I think that's one on many people's minds. Now, from the IKEA Foundation's point of view, we don't necessarily have a policy or requirements in place that we can only support NGOs through larger organizations. We partner directly with smaller national or local NGOs as well. So in some of our other portfolios that work in non-humanitarian settings, they already are doing that. So the biggest example here are in India. As we've been engaged in India for so long, we've been able to understand that landscape much better and learn about national or local NGOs that way, or who's much more better placed to engage with. So I guess for us in the humanitarian portfolio, we don't have a barrier in that sense to work with national or local NGOs, but our barrier lies more in learning about the NGO landscape at a deeper level in our send and focus countries. So I guess it's also a little reflective of the humanitarian system, where we're now seeing more efforts directed towards engaging much more directly and efficiently with local or national NGOs or a social business or whoever, again, is best placed. And we're hoping to do the same, as we do believe it's about placing leadership and course direction in the hands of those in the very same communities that are affected by man-made or natural disasters.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Annemiek, for your presentation and for bringing this really interesting perspective to the discussion. We really appreciate your being with us today. We're going to move now to our third and final presentation. We're turning to Rebecca Davies with Save the Children International. Rebecca.
Fantastic. Good morning. Thank you very much, and hello from Toronto, Canada. And before I begin, you saw on Annemiek's presentation that indeed Save the Children is a partner of the IKEA Foundation. And I want to say, number one, thank you to the IKEA Foundation, Annemiek, for this partnership. You're a true partner. It's been so often the case that within 48 hours, we've had seed funding from you to respond to children in some of the worst disasters. So you are a true partner, and the values alignment is so key. So thank you for putting that out. So I am speaking to you today as a fundraiser. I am a consultant, I've been a director, I've been on senior management teams, but I identify most as a fundraiser. And as a fundraiser, I get a bit of a chuckle over the title of this learning stream, NGO Access to Funding Sources. In the donor language that we use, that would simply mean, how can people ask people to donate, to act on their empathy? As Charlotte pointed out, more than 70% of funding does come from individuals, and we're talking about people here and people asking people. So as a human being, I'm absolutely compelled by humanitarian fundraising. As a professional, I'm continuously intrigued by the opportunities, and both the opportunities and tensions emergency and humanitarian fundraising have for our organizations, like the ones that we all represent. I'm going to show you probably the purest example, and as good as it gets. I have a number of MSF examples because I have the most case studies as a fundraising practitioner from my recent past with MSF. So you're going to see quite a bit of MSF here, another partner with the IKEA Foundation as well. And this is where I think what the holy grail of individual fundraising is in an emergency. What you see here with the blue line is the sawtooth graph, as I call it. You see moments in time where there are spikes. 2004-5, we know that disaster. 2010, we know that disaster. and 2014 and 15. It just goes up and up and up. And what a sawtooth graph will show you when you plot out your fundraising income and expenses, the orange line, over time, it will give you a health check on your own fundraising program. And so what you want to see is big steps in growth, yes, during times of acute and dramatic disaster. And yeah, there will be some dips afterwards, but you're not seeing any cliffs. It's all about what we do, what the donor journey is in between these acute disasters. And that, by the way, is a great time to talk about and raise money for, as Charlotte pointed out, some of the more silent, chronic, protracted emergencies. Somewhat more difficult to fundraise for, but the people you get on board, you will retain much longer and have a longer lifetime value from. That was the opportunity, but I also want to make the point that there is no big green button. That is, having worked on the inside for a number of NGOs now, big global ones and teeny tiny startups, as a fundraiser, I know I will never stop educating people internally about how fundraising works. There is no big green button. There is no tap that we can turn on and off of donors and revenue. There is no lineup at our door with people wanting to give. So what do we do then? What we need to make sure is that within our organization that we are always prepared for acute disasters, and as well practice best fundraising practice continuously and continuously improve upon it. So what does that look like? These are some of my top level observations or recommendations, again, from a long history and perspective of working in NGOs, in particularly humanitarian organizations. How are you going to best and most authentically, I liked what Annemiek said, keep it real. How can you demonstrate authenticity and need at the same time? Well, it comes back to your origin story. There are a lot of humanitarian agencies that claim the humanitarian imperative as their mission. There's a bunch of us. How do we differentiate ourselves from each other? Because I also believe that the world by and large needs all of us. So what is your origin story? Know it, and know it cold, and reconnect with it always, and make sure that your staff and your team do. Where have you come from? Know that. It should be on the lips of everyone who works at your NGO, and I'd say steeped in the walls and the furniture, because your origin story is your identity, and your identity is your brand. Second point I want to make is, who are your fundraisers? Who's representing you? Who's on the front lines talking about you? Are they connected to the mission? I used to say to my fundraising team, if our organization's mandate does not regularly give us goosebumps or tears, and the prospect of our organization just disappearing doesn't make our blood run cold, we're working for the wrong place. We will not be as successful as we might be somewhere else. And here's a secret too, contrary to what many people think, the best fundraisers I know are terrified during the moment of the ask, the solicitation. It's because we know what's at stake, and we believe in it so much and know the importance of fundraising in the process and to the outcome of the ability for operations to save lives in the field. And if I have a fundraising ask where my mouth doesn't get dry or my heart doesn't pound, I know it's time to look for a new job. And finally, who are your donors? Who are your donors? A donor to MSF is not a donor to Amnesty, to a local organization. They are different. There are measurable and qualitative ways to figure out who your donors are and what they best respond to. And so, again, identity, the origins, again, I'll use MSF and Save the Children where I work, fairly similar origins, the humanitarian imperative, saving lives of children, But at a point in the development of these organizations, there was a divergence, and so we can't tell the same story authentically. The cases for support are different. Save the Children is both needs and rights-based. That's a different narrative than a case for support coming out of, say, MSF, which is very reductionist and very single sector. We save lives. We're doctors. We save sector. You can't tell the story the same way, so don't try to. More whole of organization commitment before you start even fundraising. Do you know your operational principles and values, and is there executive alignment with them? It is not the time to start debating about gift acceptance issues the day or the hour that there's an earthquake and you have a crush of donors. You need to, as an organization, be in alignment and have the debates ahead of time about what our values are. When is it okay to say yes, and when is it okay to say no? We're not going to take that gift, and here's why. And what does it mean? And are you prepared not to take a gift if it means that operations won't be able to run that program? What are your fundraising tough choices? Who do you want to engage with? And who don't you want to engage with as individual donors? What does your ethical screening practice look like? What is your policy on unrestricted versus earmarked giving? What are the opportunities and challenges with institutional, corporate, designated gifts? It's all of this needs to be discussed, debated ahead of time, and written down in policies and guidelines to steer and to guide those fundraisers having difficult conversations sometimes. Organizational ambition it's very important. What is your organization's North Star? It's not just waiting for an emergency to another emergency to happen and to be reactive. Even the most reactive of humanitarian organizations have great and sound strategic planning. So what is that North Star for your organization? And does your leadership rally everyone regularly to monitor and to motivate everyone from the board to staff toward that North Star goal? You do not want emergencies to define the high points of your organization. Is fundraising the servant of field programs? What do I mean by that? Your donor will pick up very quickly if you are fundraising or making an ask or a pitch or proposal for something clearly that is maybe not pure to your organization's mandate, and possibly because the funder is more in tune with the funder's funding guidelines. It's not sustainable to do that for your organization, and the funder will quickly pick up on that. So let fundraising be of service to our beneficiaries and our programs, and let our board of directors serve the executive, including the fundraisers. Okay, so there's some of the organizational hygiene, as I said, that I believe needs to be discussed and sorted out. So if you're at the point of fundraising, here in 3 minutes are my top 5 tips for fundraising in emergencies for individuals. Number 1, again, be prepared. Be prepared. Have a plan. Have it written down. Have it digitally. Have multiple perspectives in there. We cannot fundraise in a vacuum. We need the input of communications programs, humanitarian advocacy, all of it. Have it written down. Share it with your partners, your suppliers. Have everybody's WhatsApp, cell phone, multiple cell phone numbers in there so that everyone is reachable and everyone should have a backup. Turn your plan into checklists. That's something we're starting to do at Save the Children. Make it foolproof in that hour when the adrenaline is pumping and you have minutes to get live online, to get your story out there, to claim that space. It's fantastic to have a checklist so that it's almost automatic. Simulations, do simulations on your plan. It works beautifully. Pre-positioned budget for emergencies. Yes, in many cases, some of them Charlotte outlined. The Nepal earthquake is a great example. Thank you, Charlotte. The money will come in. There might be a big green button, but do you have enough budget to process those gifts? There can be some surprises. The more opportunity, the more cost if you're going to process the gifts properly and account for them. Do you have enough enough surplus budget, a reserve budget for credit card fees, for processing fees, for return envelopes, and to be able to, in 1 week, 1 month, 6 months, 1 year, 18 months, create a donor impact report and mail it to everybody. Don't be surprised by the cost of the opportunity at the same time, and always debrief on lessons learned. If I can offer you some technical and tactical advice, if you are new to individual private fundraising in emergencies, a good point of entry is to be digitally ready. Get your digital program going. You will receive half of your income within the first 24 hours that you're live or proactive in your digital fundraising. So again, you will receive half of your income within the first 24 hours. So again, attend to your pre-emergency work. Make sure that your IT infrastructure can manage that load, both on the phone and online when disaster strikes. Have your search terms developed ahead of time. Develop generic images to pre-populate before you can get an image from the field. On that first day, you're going to, again, with a view to digital readiness, update your web page, you're going to update your donation page, you're going to take care of paid search, you're going to do a press release, you're going to send out your first email, you're going to monitor social media, and you're going to push out fundraising messages through social media, display ads, SMS, crowdfunding. Day 2, so the name of the game on day 1 is to just be in that space. Of course, if there is the need for your organization to be there, and if in fact you're on the ground, but be first, be fast, as we say. Days 2 and 3, you can maybe differentiate your organization with pictures from the ground and start to update your assets that you have already done already. You might think about things like lead generation. Days 4 through 7, keep doing much of the same, but as soon as you can, and I would say in day 2 and 3, it's best to just start reporting back. I remember in MSF during the Haiti earthquake, we were sending and always testing everything, sending out emails every about 8 hours in the beginning, and sometimes taking a page from our crisis communications team, we would send out emails to say, we have nothing to say right now. We have no new news. And the click-through rates, the open rates, the donations that came through some of those emails was outstanding. Test everything. I've mentioned that before. In an emergency, do not be perfect. Do not expect perfection, but always be testing everything, especially on digital. Telemarketing script 2 is a great way, and my favorite way, to test out some language and some positioning that can inform offline emergency fundraising content. So what you hear on the phones and what your A/B testing is telling you online absolutely can be applied to your direct mail appeals, to your unaddressed householders, to your major donor conversations, and to your corporate proposals. Just ship it, as we say as well. Do not let perfection be the enemy of done. I think that's the expression, something like that. Don't forget, always, during an emergency, and again, I'm biasing this presentation more to acute, dramatic natural disaster types, but do not forget to engage your major donors, your legacy donors, and your corporate partners. They are your champions. They're the ones, when you reach out, who will and are just waiting for you to ask them to give, to act, to host an event, open doors. IKEA at the national level has been outstanding partners for Save the Children in answering the calls and donating goods and gifts in kind when we need them in very specific cases. So your one-to-one, your high net worth individuals, your corporate partners are your best champions in an emergency as well. And so often it's hard to carve out the space to make those phone calls, but it is, you owe it to them. And they will lift your response in ways you can't even imagine and introduce people to you. And logistically, I can't count the number of times where a corporate partner has given us access to somewhere. Engage them on social media, ask them to retweet, ask them to host events. And we were talking about Syria before. We asked a major donor to host an event for us in Syria for the Syrian conflict in 2012 when nobody else would. It was a matter of a phone call from my CEO to one of our top funders to say, you're a top funder, major donor. Please be a leader. Please be the one that shows Canada that Syria needs major private funding. So after you've received your gifts from your various donors and your various channels, I can't stress enough that stewardship of your donors and accountability for the gifts is 85% of your next ask. So thank your donors like you've never thanked them before. Be creative. I think we all remember this. The Time Magazine's Person of the Year 2015 was the Ebola fighters. I bought, I think, about 100 copies of that, and I sent it to many, many donors who supported us during that crisis. And I thanked them personally and identified them as the Time Person of the Year. And the gratitude and the satisfaction and the reactivation of those gifts, I have never seen anything like that. So be creative and be thoughtful about stewarding your donors when it's all over, because there will be another one. And I will leave this as my last point. Explain your decisions. Sometimes donors wish for your organization, because you are beloved to them, to behave in a certain way or act in a certain way that you cannot according to your own principles. In one case, this was very, very emotional and very difficult. It was MSF's response to the Japanese earthquake and tsunami, where we were not taking any restricted gifts. And those conversations were difficult, as I said, thanking donors who wanted to give. And what we needed to do was convert our donors' emotional reactions into rational decisions. So we thanked the donors for wanting to give. We took the time, really took the time to listen to the donor, to understand the motivations behind their philanthropy. And finally, and most difficultly, we explained that MSF could not accept their restricted gift to Japanese relief, and tried to help them understand that by de-restricting donations are as much a simple compassion as are the earmarked ones. And in the end, 98.9% of donors de-restricted their Japanese donations and gave generally to MSF Canada to help prepare us for the next response and the next emergency. So difficult conversations can turn into some of your best donors. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for that inspiring presentation. We have immediately 2 follow-up questions based on this. Now, the tips that you've given are really terrific. Rosia noticed that the tips seem that they would be best placed for NGOs who are quite advanced. Would you have any more specific recommendations for small or local organizations, including those who might involve mostly volunteers? And then Zubeida in the USA is asking if you would have any advice for how small new NGOs could collaborate with bigger, more experienced NGOs like the ones you've been involved in to build their experience and their knowledge in fundraising. Over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you. Oh, what thoughtful questions. I'll start with the last one first. To that, I would say, how can smaller organizations leverage the expertise of larger ones? First of all, I don't want there to be an assumption that smaller organizations are any less powerful in their fundraising and professional in their fundraising. So if I made that assumption, please forgive me. That's not the assumption. But there is a case that some larger and global organizations might have access to more information and expertise and experience. What I would say there is, number one, you can join, we're talking about fundraising here, professional fundraising, seek out and join a local fundraising association. There are many, and they're around the world. And the advantages of joining a professional fundraising association is in the word association, in that you can meet and benchmark and attend conferences with all kinds of organizations. I would say as well that there's a nice character about fundraisers and the profession, and that we do like to share. It is a fairly new profession. It's still being demystified by many people. We like to benchmark our data because we want to beat not only our own control, but know where we sit in the market, and you know, do we have market share, or do we have somewhere to go? So casually asking people for help and insight is something I've done, and people call me every day as well, and I would welcome any calls to that end. So join an association, and don't be afraid to reach out. The first question, I forget what it is. Can you please prompt me about what the first question was?
Sure.
Yeah,
okay, so I think that you've handled it. We were asking for your advice on how smaller organizations could do some of the things that you were talking about, because some of the tips that you were giving were for maybe bigger NGOs would have an easier time to do some of those.
Okay, so I would respectfully maybe challenge that assumption too. I did try to think very grassroots. So things like, if I go back to my own presentation, know your origin story, know what your values and principles are, and have policies and guidelines against them or to support them, so that when your volunteers, who are your most powerful mouthpieces in many, many cases, no matter what size your organization is, I would say having a volunteer army be the one to tell your story and ask for your money is the greatest credibility in a solicitor. So providing them with the origin story, providing them with the policies and guidelines, and yeah, digital. And I deliberately chose digital because it's not very expensive. Everyone has a website to invest in to make sure that you are pre-prepared. So I'm going to think about that some more, and I would love to be able to contribute more, but do take to heart some of those tips and tricks, because I myself am always involved in starting up an NGO or a project here and there, and I do implement those for my own, I'd say, passion projects or hobby organizations that I'm currently involved in.
Okay, so thank you so much, Rebecca, and thanks also to Charlotte and Annemiek again for your presentations. We'll be moving in just a minute to open things up for additional Q&A and discussion. Before we do, I know Charlotte had a power cut. If we could try testing your new connection before we move on. Charlotte, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here. Can you all hear me?
Yes, that sounds great. Okay, excellent. So we are all set to move ahead into the Q&A, and I will give the floor to Melissa to moderate.
Since we've got Charlotte back on the line, let's start with Charlotte. Some of the questions that we've received relate to the landscape of humanitarian financing with regard to private sector funding. Sandy, who's based in Denmark, asked if you have noticed any trend in the size of companies engaged in humanitarian action. Are most of them major enterprises or smaller companies? Are you seeing trends there? The second question related to that comes from Anna in South Africa. she was asking where the individuals are located who are giving funds from their own pockets. Are these individuals who are contributing to humanitarian action largely people in affected countries themselves, or are they people in non-affected countries? Over to you, Charlotte.
Okay, thanks very much, Melissa, and very good questions. The first question from Sandy, in terms of trends in size, I mean, I think we have to dig through the data really to answer that question fully. There are, you know, a handful of really large, you know, trusts and foundations and companies that we see, you know, dominating year on year and crisis upon crisis. And, you know, IKEA is obviously one of the major ones, and there are others. But I think what we also see is that the smaller private organizations that are involved might tend to be, you know, focused particularly on responses in particular countries or in response to particular sectors and things. So it's difficult to generalize, and I think in order to give you a better answer to that question, I'd have to really kind of pick through the data a bit and see if we can pick up any trends that might be interesting and might help you in terms of thinking about targeting private donors for funding. And then the question from Anna, that's also a really interesting question about where individuals are located, and I think that's not actually possible to see from the data, because the data that we gather from NGOs and from UN partners indeed is looks at, you know, just volumes of funding, and so it doesn't break it down in terms of where that funding came from geographically. But I think you know, if you look at the nature of the organisation, so if we look at you know, private funding for an organisation that's based in the UK, for example, or based in Germany, say, I think we can, you know, you can probably assume that the bulk of the funding that they're getting from individuals is from individuals in those countries. And in terms of the individual giving in crisis-affected countries, that's a big unknown for all of us, I think, because that private funding tends not to be tracked. So we have big, you know, reporting systems and things like the UN OCHA financial tracking service and these kind of systems, where that sort of individual giving in crisis-affected countries from people within those countries is largely invisible at the moment. So I think, and that's something that generally, you know, there's been a lot more of a push recently in terms of looking at research to find out if we can find out what resources are available much more at the local level, not only what trickles down through the international system to local and national responders, but what is actually coming from governments in crisis-affected countries and general populations, you know, individuals giving. So I think I hope there'll be more to say about that in the future, but at the moment it's a really big question mark.
Thank you, Charlotte. Next, I'd like to turn to Anmiek, and we've received some questions with regard to corporate social responsibility. First, Shaukat in Bangladesh was asking if you consider the work that you do as connected to corporate social responsibility, this concept, and then as a follow-up to that, how do you think NGOs can influence corporate social responsibility? And then Helen, who actually works on corporate social responsibility herself, she was asking about what types of engagement you would like to pursue beyond funding partners, for example, skills-based volunteering or some of the other kinds of support that we referenced at the beginning of the webinar. So over to you, Anmiek.
Excellent. Thank you for those questions. It's on Shopat's question if we can be considered to be part of IKEA CSR strategy. I mean, when it was those social initiatives and funded through different IKEA entities, that was very much part of CSR. And when all those programs, were put under the umbrella of the foundation, and we started to program according to our own mandate and objectives, then that's when it's sort of moved beyond CSR. It's really much driven by our own objectives and our own individuality as a foundation. You'll still see us reported on in the sustainability report by IKEA, but you know, again, as we're our own entity, we have our own annual reports and our other materials. And IKEA actually still does CSR. So when stores engage with local organizations, that you can consider that to be a CSR kind of activity. So, and that's how we see it as well. So there's the alignment with IKEA on core themes. So, and I guess sometimes it is more difficult to say because not all corporates have a separate foundation. So often you'll see that engagement is coming from within a CSR department, and in that way much more likely to have to be aligned with business interests. But we don't necessarily have that requirement. And then on how to influence policies, I guess the first step is by having an honest dialogue with the private sector actor you're engaging with, and really show them also what elements are preventing a social issue from being resolved or addressed. And really look for that larger bit, a meaningful partnership that includes, for instance, not only financial support or in kind, but it really uses that corporate knowledge and expertise, and really involve them in the dialogues that you're having with other stakeholders. Really make them part of the conversation, because again, we're needing different levels of different actors to all come to the same point. So, and I suppose also showing how the change in policy for them in the CSR policy is actually supporting you with the work you're doing. And then, it slightly relates to the question by Helen of what types of engagement we would pursue. And this is actually where I have to again draw on the fact that we're a different entity than IKEA as a business. So it's more difficult for us to leverage the IKEA people more directly. So what we do as a foundation is absolutely look for those opportunities to make sure that there's the opportunity to engage IKEA expertise and knowledge when possible. And then a big example in that is the Better Shelter, where we were able to get IKEA expertise in to work with UNHCR and really look for a different shelter option. But it's definitely what I mean with a meaningful partnership is sort of going beyond the CSR. I mean, that is where you find that relationship with private sector can be extremely valuable, that you really have those other elements that you can draw on.
Thank you so much. Now I'd like to turn back to Rebecca. One of the things you talked about in your presentation was the power of empathy, of people supporting people, and the significant proportion of funding that comes from individuals. You did mention in your tips the notion of crowdfunding. Olivier in Switzerland was asking if you could elaborate a little bit more on your experience using crowdfunding. It's kind of a new frontier for many of us. So that's the first question related to crowdfunding. And the second question comes from Roxanne in the UK. Based on, you had a nice a graph at the top of your presentation showing spikes in support. And Roxanne in the UK was asking if you have noticed spikes in support from private donors, from individuals in the aftermath of, for example, bans from bilateral donors or from governments on specific support for specific sectors. For example, there's a recent move in the United States to stop funding for specific activities related to reproductive health. So that is a question that maybe you would have experience seeing based in the course of your work. So those are the two questions. Back to you, Rebecca.
Thank you very much. Great questions. Crowdfunding is a great tool to offer donors. And so what we will often do is ask donors, I like to call it a triple ask. Ask your monthly donors during an emergency to do crowdfunding for you, or peer-to-peer funding. So make sure you have that digitally available to them. Or there are also online platforms like Just Giving in the UK, might be even more global than that you can point them to. An interesting fact about crowdfunding is that last year's statistic, peer-to-peer platforms and online social fundraising platforms were outpacing new users to both Twitter and Facebook. So crowdfunding absolutely is a powerful tool, and it also is a point of engagement for your donors. Donors want to do more, and I didn't say this yet, I should have, than write a check or give money to their favorite organizations or to a cause that has so moved them. they want to do something more. And so ask them to do a peer-to-peer fundraising campaign is a very powerful thing. We have, Save the Children celebrities that have done crowd funding for us recently to the tune of $100,000 for our search and rescue vehicle. Absolutely a viable choice, a channel choice during an emergency because it is quick as well. To the more resistance question, well, we all saw what happened and the benefit that Planned Parenthood got early on in the American election. I'll say that. So sometimes it can be a reaction by donors to pick one organization to fund as an act of resistance. In other cases, organizations can be more proactive in raising their brand, asking for money when policy changes do occur. And again, it comes back to my insistence on really knowing who you are and what are your no-go zones. MSF has come out very strongly yesterday, speaking out against the global gag order. Other organizations who are perhaps more reliant on government funding in areas may be more soft pedal. So it really depends on your organization's stance, advocacy stance, and yeah, I mean, that does trickle down to the fundraising approach and what I call fundraise from the front lines. If you are a more moderate organization, you probably have more moderate donors, and you're not going to pick up the phone and say, hey, this thing happened, will you react against it with a private donation? But if you're Greenpeace and you do not take government money, you do not take corporate money, what a great opportunity to hang a sign off of a crane with the White House in the backdrop. So again, know thyself, know thy organization, know your principles, values, what's important to you, what is a no-go zone and what is an opportunity. And then take that message absolutely to individual donors.
Thank you. This next question might be a tough question. I'll give a chance to Annemiek and to Rebecca to take a crack at it. It comes from Benita in Belgium, and she said, if you had to pick the one biggest mistake that NGOs make when they're trying to engage business, when they're trying to engage the private sector, how can they avoid this mistake? So what is the biggest mistake, and how can they avoid it, especially if they're on a very small budget? So maybe we'll turn over to Annemiek first, if you have an answer to that. Over to you.
Yeah, I appreciate the question by Benita very much. And it is a tough one to crack, for sure. But I think two things that come to mind and also relate a little bit to the slides that I presented on. I think for us, what we find important is that we have an honest dialogue. So we much rather talk to an NGO who is humble in that respect, who can show us how they're driving change, who can show what true leadership looks like, and that we really get to see that inside of an NGO rather than necessarily being met by I don't want to say the word fluff, but that we don't necessarily get to the bottom of what it is that they need in order for them to drive effective change to the people that they're trying to help. And I think that's one of the things that makes us weary if we have an organization that doesn't really get to the bottom of it or tries to speak too widely about a certain topic, or it's not really clear what the topic is on. So, and suppose in that to really show how they sit in that and where their specialty lies. So I think that's one, not necessarily the biggest mistake, but that often is something that is actually quite easy to pick up on, and that we find usually prevents us from wanting to engage. And when you're a little bit smaller, I guess it goes back to trying to stay true to yourself. And again, Rebecca's comments also about know who you are and where you come from. Take on things that you can realistically manage. And we're quite nervous when a relatively small organization would ask very largely or envisage to grow very fast. And I think we have to take responsible ownership and help them grow in a moderate way and really take a paced approach. But it's I think it's also something that could really damage an organization. And in our experience we see because we have the opportunity to step in relatively large with small organization, it's also our responsibility to safeguard it that doesn't damage the organization as well. So I guess from my side, I think those are the two things that will come up. And just the last point, sorry, I also know you asked Melissa to comment, but I think for us as a private sector philanthropy or foundation, that we're also seen as that, only as a private sector inclusion. I think we want to be seen as part of the solution, as part of that conversation, and that we want to learn from the NGO as well. So not necessarily only asking for in-kind or necessarily asking for financials. I think that's also, when we spoke about it, I think that's also a really big thing to consider when you're working with an entity that has a lot of other tools in their toolbox. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. Over to you, Rebecca. Do you have anything to say about the biggest mistake that NGOs make?
Many. I've got many. I'm going to speak to my, again, I'm going to represent the fundraiser here and mistakes we can make and that I have made. Number one, it comes back to my first point. Corporations are led by people and conversations happen between people. And so just always remember that. And so many things can be disarmed, or so much more can be done joyfully with the recognition that you're having a conversation with people and not just a big faceless corporation. Slow and no follow-up is something that I have seen myself and my team be guilty of in the past, and there are consequences to it. It's not professional, it's not respectful, and it might give the air of maybe insubstantial information that was asked for. So slow and no follow-up, and always be transparent. That's my third tip. This is a very interesting one because so often it's the fundraiser or the CEO or the volunteer that's engaging with the corporate, and we know that that it's a process, it's a dialogue, and sometimes I've been in the case in a situation where maybe it's a programs person or a financial officer doesn't want to release certain information, but we know that if it's been requested, it's for a reason. There's a reason it's being evaluated. And as Annemiek said, the beautiful thing about working with corporate partners is that the true ones are there to help you professionalize. Then they want to be in turn part of the solution as well. So it really, really is win-win. So never not be transparent or provide the information asked, even if it's poor or non-existent. That's also a starting point for a conversation about why those things are the case.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I know it's quite early there in Toronto, but the last two questions are for you. The first question is asked by two people, actually, Ilaria in El Salvador and Shmuti in Switzerland. They're both interested in this issue of accountability. And they ask, how can we improve and ensure accountability of funding when it comes from the private sector? So that's the first question. The second question comes from Ayman in Syria, because one of our webinars actually looked at the concept of pooling funds as one of the ways to contribute to humanitarian financing. And he was asking, how could private funds be more organized? Could they be more systematized through a pooled fund, for example? So I don't know with your work if you've noticed anything that would look like that. So over to you, Rebecca.
Okay, I'm not sure I fully understand the second question, and the question back would be, is this related specifically to Syria? Yeah, let me think on that one, but I'll answer the first one. Accountability is everything. It is no different than reporting back to an institutional or a government donor. And the trend in some NGOs is, in fact, that the institutional grant writers are actually sitting in the fundraising department. So accountability is everything. It builds donor loyalty, trust, and commitment, and future and bigger gifts. So do what you say you're going to do with the money. Ask on the basis of need. At the time of the ask, present when and how you're going to report back on that donor's investment in your NGO for that project. And accountability is, again, always an opportunity for a dialogue. There's a trend right now around failure reports, and that is accountability as well. We were not able to use the money or the funds in the way that you trusted us to, and this is how we use them, and this is the outcome. So it's all, accountability is transparency. Accountability is having a cadence to the communications and the report that the donor anticipates. So again, at the time of the ask, tell them how and when you're going to account for their gift and do it. No different than accounting to a government donor. As possible, invite donors to see the work on the ground and have them be the ones to report back to other donors about what they saw. Like, there is that third-party arm's length credibility all of a sudden as well. So on the private side, you know, I always say stewardship. You steward the donor, you account for the gift, and you know, you've done 85% of your next solicitation if you do it well.
Thank you for that, Rebecca. I can ask the pool fund question actually to Charlotte, if you like, because Charlotte is quite involved in some of the discussions underway related to the grand bargain. And in the grand bargain, there's a look at using pooled funding mechanisms more usefully. And we've seen a lot of, for example, bilateral government donors pooling their funds into things like country-based pooled funds. So it could be specific for Syria, or it could be thematic, like education cannot wait. So I wonder, Charlotte, from your experience looking at pooled funds, do you think this concept could be applied to private sector funding? Over to you.
Yes, thanks, Melissa. I think the principles and the sort of mechanisms of pooled funds absolutely could be open to receiving funding from private donors, and I think there are examples, and this is not a pooled fund, but it's a kind of a joint endeavour. Would be examples like the Disasters Emergency Committee, where you have in the UK you have the really big, I think it's 13 leading aid organisations that raise funds collectively and then pool that money and they find that they're more effective together, both in terms of getting government funding, but more critically getting private funding. And then I think if you look at some of the NGO-led pooled funds, and one of the biggest at the moment would be the START Fund, run by the START Network. And I actually don't know if any of the funding for the START Fund comes from private donors, but there's no reason why it couldn't. The mechanism is there, and the beauty of something like that is that the focus is not just on the high-profile emergencies that are more successful in getting funding anyway through a lot of media and their social media attention, but actually from underfunded, typically sort of neglected emergencies, the less high-profile and quite often quite small scale in the global scheme of things, but in terms of the impact on people affected, really dramatic. So they've I know that there are discussions at the moment about looking at NGO-led pooled funds, which would be open for government and private funding at regional country level, and looking at trying to pilot some ideas on that. So yes, I think there's not a lot to say in practice yet about getting private funding for pooled funds, but certainly the potential is there.
In many community foundations, there will be donor advised funds that are often pooled as well. So there's another source there. Thank you for the coalition point as well.
Okay, terrific. So thanks so much. Unfortunately, we are running now to the end of our time, so we're going to have to wrap things up. I'd like to thank, of course, all of our participants. We had a great number of questions come in, and I saw that there was a very active discussion in the chat as well. Thanks to our guests, our speakers for engaging also so much in the chat. Very much appreciated by all. For the questions that we weren't able to get to in this Q&A portion, we will endeavor to follow up in writing and add those responses to the extent possible to the full suite of resources that will be available and linked to this whole series of events. As we start to wrap up, I would like to go around the virtual room one more time to each of our guest speakers to ask if they have any very brief concluding thoughts to leave us with. So we'll go first to Annemiek, then to Charlotte, and then to Rebecca. Over to you, Annemiek.
Thank you very much. From my end, I just want to thank the teams at ICVA and PHAP for the opportunity to share a little bit more about IKEA and the IKEA Foundation. We're excited to have been part of the conversation. And again, we truly believe in supporting the people who have had to flee violence or natural events, that they have to be supported in setting up their own home again and provide for their children. So I'm extremely excited about the engagement also that I've had in the chat box and the questions I'm asked, because at the end of the day, we're all looking for a more efficient response that really puts the people who are affected at the heart of it. So I also appreciate my co-hosts. I enjoyed learning from them too. Of course, they're both also a very big source of knowledge and expertise. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for your contribution to the discussion today. And moving to Charlotte. Charlotte, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think just in terms of concluding remarks, I think I just want to come back to something I said at the end of my presentation in terms of the way things are changing, the pace of change in terms of humanitarian funding generally, because it's really an area of scrutiny at the moment. But in terms of the private actors and their role in that as donors or as contributors is really exciting, and I think it's an area to watch. It's hard to keep track of because not all of the funding from private actors is visible. As I said, a lot of it is invisible, and it's really important to keep, in the name of transparency and in the name of accountability to people affected by crises, it's really important that we all kind of play a part in trying to make sure that we are reporting private funding that you're receiving as organizations and implementing on behalf of crisis affected people. And I think, just looking at the chat that's gone on through the session, there's a huge wealth of knowledge obviously within the group and in the wider community out there. And I think we all need to keep, as things keep moving so fast and new partnerships are developing and new ideas coming in, really keep learning from each other. And lastly, just to say, to echo the thanks very much to co-hosts and co-presenters today for the opportunity to participate. It's been a fascinating session.
Great. Thank you so much. We really appreciated your contribution and are so glad you could join us. And now for Rebecca, we'll give you the last word here. Over to you.
I guess my parting wish would be that we always remember the donor and remember to bring donor motivation to the extent that our organizations are funded privately into the strategic planning conversations we have and into some operational discussions that we do have. I find the notion of the donor as a stakeholder so absent in NGO discussions. And so I just want us to remember always to bring that donor into the discussion, and from there, what are the consequences or the opportunities that come from inviting more private funding and more private donors into the organization. And that is actually a good point as well. The more you budget for private income, private revenue, the more you're going to have to open the door a little bit more and lift up the hood a bit more of your NGO's car, because donors these days, and it's only getting more and more, have expectations of engagement, and also the expectation of looking under the hood and seeing where the money went and how the operation is being run. So if you're going to invite more private funding, you're going to have to anticipate having people come into your house. And
absolutely. Thank you.
For a while, yeah. Yeah.
Very important food for thought, and I think a really excellent way to wrap up the discussion on today's topic. One more thank you to all three of our guest speakers. Regarding the recording of today's session and the mentioned resources, these will all be available in the next few days on the event webpage. You can see the link there on the screen in front of you. And once translated, there will also be subtitles to the recording in both French and Arabic. Melissa, I'd like to hand the floor over to you to give us a bit of a preview of what's coming next.
Thank you. We will be putting together the whiteboard video and a briefing paper on this topic. Given the interest expressed by participants in previous sessions, in March, we will hold an additional humanitarian financing session on the Grand Bargain on humanitarian financing. And this is to provide NGOs and others with information on where the Grand Bargain came from, what is the process, who is involved, and what is its potential to improve the efficiency of humanitarian financing. Now, there are 10 different work streams in the Grand Bargain, and we ask participants to vote on which work streams they would like to learn more about. So we will, in our session, focus on these 3 work streams. Number 1, multi-year planning and funding, which we've talked about today. Number 2, harmonized and simplified reporting requirements. This is an issue that came up from some of your questions that we didn't have a chance to discuss today, but something that affects us all. And number 3 is looking at the humanitarian development nexus. And just to leave you also with a quick reminder about the previous sessions in this series on humanitarian financing, you can now access all recordings and additional resources on the 4 subjects that we've already covered in this series, including the follow-up answers to those questions that were left unanswered live, but to which our very dedicated guest experts have written responses to. So you can find all of those Q&As and the other resources for the previous sessions on the relevant event pages. You can also access them directly now if you want to go straight there by clicking on the banners. So that wraps it up for today. Thanks so much again to everyone, our participants, our guests, my co-host Melissa, for the really great environment here, proactive involvement, interesting questions, shedding light on so many different aspects of the subject. We look forward to welcoming all of you again back very soon. And with that, I'll sign off and thank you. Over to Melissa for last word. Just thank you to PHAP, thank you to James, my colleague at ICVA, and especially big thanks to all of you. Really great questions coming in, and our speakers were excellent. I'm very excited about our next webinar, so thank you and look forward to the next time.